Welcome to Christian Virtual Fellowship. Christian Virtual Fellowship is the online church of Allegiance to the King. Christian Virtual Fellowship is an online church home for isolated biblical Unitarians. We gather at least twice a week to praise God and Jesus, to pray together, to grow in God's Word, and to strengthen and encourage one another. We're glad you found our channel. And we invite you to check out our website at a2kchurch.org, where you can contact us if you would like to come and visit our church online. Today, we are going to continue our study of the book of Judges. Now, is my big screen showing right now? Someone could tell me.
Yes.
Thank,
Yes.
thank you, Lee. In part one, and today we're going to cover part three. So in part one, we read of the Israelites continuing to worship false idols, despite their seeing the miracles that had happened, even as Joshua led them to battle. And that lack of faithfulness on their part prevented God from giving them total victory, where they could occupy all the land that God had promised. So God caused the Israelites to live side by side with the pagan nations. And in a way, it was to test Israelites' faithfulness. Sadly, the Israelites forgot their God and committed horrible sins that resulted in the vicious cycle depicted in this image, repeating over and over again. Part one is essentially an overview of chapters 3 through 16. And as you can see it by the image here, there is this repeated cycle that is reported in the book of Judges. First, at the top, Israel is cool. The people are serving God and experiencing peace. But what happens is that because they are living side by side with the pagan natives, they marry them, they fall into idolatry, worshiping false idols, false gods, and they do terrible things like child sacrifice and immoral deeds. And so eventually what happens is that God turns them over to their enemies. And we have one enemy after another popping up through chapters 3 through 16. And so eventually Israel cries out to God, remembering, for example, Exodus, where God rescued Israel from the Egyptians and the like. And God turns to God and repents. And then God takes action and rises up a man or a woman to deliver Israel. And we call those persons, we call them judges, hence the name of the book, Book of Judges. And so that's what we're going to go over with. And we're going to be covering chapters 6, 7, and 8, which deals with the judge Gideon. Now, in part two, we had, and let me go over part two with you just really quickly if you haven't already seen it. In part two, we reviewed the first 4 of 13 judges. There was Othniel, who was a Judean. The second judge was a left-handed Benjamite assassin named Ehud, who killed the oppressor king named Eglon. The third judge was not an Israelite, but a convert. And little is really told about the personal lives of these 3 men. They were faithful in executing their duty to God with great courage. And the fourth judge was the only one who actually acted as a law court judge. And that's Deborah, who was both a wife and a mother. And she was also a prophetess and was so respected by all of Israel that when there was a serious legal dispute, they went to her for her to hear the case and make the judgment. Well, one day, after years of Canaanite oppression, Deborah called out certain tribes of Israel to fight the Canaanites. The Canaanites had worshipped a storm god named Baal. Ironically, God sent a torrential thunderstorm to paralyze the iron chariots of the pagans who had worshipped the storm god, and thereby they were defeated. A Canaanite general was also killed by a Midianite woman named Jael. And all of that resulted in peace that lasted 40 years. But the vicious cycle we saw earlier, the Israelites turned away from God and served false idols. And now we're going to go into what happened next. And so this would be the fifth time that the Israelites had turned away from God. So let's get into Judges chapter 6. So as an overview of chapter 6, 7, and 8, I submit to you this for your consideration. First, God calls and tests Gideon. Then when there's a foreign invasion, okay, here we go. First, God calls and tests Gideon. Then when there's a foreign invasion, God gives Gideon Holy Spirit, and Gideon rallies local tribal militias to fight the invaders. Gideon repeatedly asks for confirmation about God's plan. Gideon obeys God and goes to battle the invaders. God has prepared the victory and hands it to the Israelites. The Israelites, led by Gideon, exploit the victory to win the peace. Gideon deals with Israelites and others who do not help him when asked to. He then returns to private life and makes some big mistakes. Israel has peace for 40 years. So now that we know what the record is generally about, let's get into the juicy details. Judges chapter 6. Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord handed them over to Midian for 7 years. The power of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. So they actually made caves and dens and hiding places. For whenever Israel had sowing crops, the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the people of the east and march against them. So they would camp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, nor sheep, ox, or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come in like locusts in number, and they and their camels were innumerable, and they came into the land to ruin it. So Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. So again, we first find that Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Those who were to be God's image bearers, bringing light and life to the world, instead conformed to the evil of the surrounding nations. God handed them over to the Midianite oppressors. But what's interesting is that not all Midianites were bad. Well, who were the Midianites? In Genesis, after Abraham's wife Sarah passed away, after she died, in Genesis 25, we're told, now Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah. She bore to him Zimron, Jokshan, Medan, Midian. So Midian was actually a son of Abraham, but he was not the son of promise as Isaac was. Now, during the time of Exodus, their territory, the territory of Midian, apparently also included portions of the Sinai Peninsula. The land of Midian was also where Moses spent his 40 years in exile after killing an Egyptian. During those years, he married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. Not all the Midianites uh, were, in fact, the Israelites' enemies. For example, the Midianite clan, known as the Kenites, were allied with Israelites and eventually merged with the tribe of Judah. The heroine of the book of Judges, Jael, was the wife of a Midianite who lived among the Israelites, and we covered that account last time in part two. And just for your general information, here is a map that shows where Midian is circled in red. It's over by the Gulf of Aqaba off of the Red Sea. So it's really quite a ways from Israel if you take a look at it. Now it came about when the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of Midian, that the Lord sent a prophet to the sons of Israel, and he said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. It was I who brought you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. And I rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians and from the hands of all your oppressors. And I drove them out from you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. I am Yahweh your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not obeyed me." Then the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midians. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, valiant warrior." So, having set the stage for Israel's needing God's deliverance, the story of Gideon starts with focusing on the angel of the Lord. He sits under a tree owned by Gideon's father. Gideon is not a little boy or a lad, he is a farmer working his father's farm. He is not using a threshing floor as one would normally use, but a winepress to thresh his father's wheat so he can hide the food from the Midianites. Gideon's reply to the angel reveals that he has listened to the unnamed prophet who reminded Israel that God had rescued Israel from the Egyptians. In verse 13, it reads in chapter 6, "Then Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, Did the Lord not bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to Midian." And the Lord, and this is referring to the angel of the Lord, and the Lord looked at him and said, "Go in this strength of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you?" So apparently, Gideon has not connected the worship of false gods to all the oppression that Israel is suffering, and that God was disciplining his people for that unfaithfulness. He knows about Exodus, but did he know about the past unfaithfulness that resulted in God sending Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, and Deborah? It doesn't seem so. So here is a depiction of that happening, although I don't believe the angel of the Lord had those beautiful white wings. So Gideon complains, "But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to Midian." And the Lord looked at him and said, "Go in the strength of yours and save Israel from the hand of the Midian. Have I not sent you?" Well, what strength did this farmer have? What power did he have? He knew that God was the Savior of his people. The angel speaking for God said, "Have I not sent you?" That was Gideon's authorization to be God's agent to save the Israelites. 4 times before, God had watched Israel be unfaithful and practice evil. And now, a 5th time, God reaches out with mercy and grace. Note, God did not send the angel to liberate Israel, but instead to appoint a man. And this is just for your general edification here. Here are two photos um, of wine presses. And the one on the left is just a something dug out of the stone, a hole in the stone, and then a depression for crushing the grapes. And then it would run into that hole where then it would be put presumably into jars or pitchers. And then the one on the right is perhaps a more well-developed wine press, and you could see where people would come and stomp on the grapes. And then at the bottom of the page, there's a place where it would run, the juice would run in, and it would be caught. So here's a picture of a threshing floor, and it's has some beautiful woodwork around it and a couple of lounge chairs. So maybe this is a part of a hotel or something. But in any case, a threshing floor is a flat, round surface where grains like wheat or barley are separated from their husks. It was traditionally done by beating the grain with a flail or by using animals to trample it. Or one could grab a bunch of wheat stalks and beat the stalks on the hard surface to knock off the grain. Then the winnowing of all this needs the wind to blow away the chaff while the heavier grain falls to the ground. You might notice this looks like it's on top of a hillside. A threshing floor would be built where it can be windy. So a pile of grain would result at the farmer's feet to be put into the barn. And here are two pictures of men in modern days winnowing. After they thresh, they throw it all up, and the wind carries away the chaff, and the grain falls to the ground. So Judges chapter 6:15. But he said to him, Gideon said to the angel, O Lord, how am I to save Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. Yet the Lord said to him, I will certainly be with you, and you will defeat Midian as one man. So Gideon seems to understand that God is speaking to him through this person who's sitting under the oak tree. He asks an honest question: how am I to save Israel? The answer is truly amazing when you think about it. I will certainly be with you. Who else do you need? Who has the resources greater than I will be with you? You are complete in him. But Gideon wasn't sure who he was speaking with. There was Yahweh and there was Baal, the storm and fertility god. His father worshiped Baal, but Gideon knew of Yahweh and knew of him rescuing Israel at times. So so continuing here in the middle of the page here, I have, I will be with you. God had said these words to Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, and Jesus said the words, I am with you always in Matthew 28. So carrying on in Judges, so Gideon said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, then perform for me a sign that it is you speaking with me. Please do not depart from here until I come back to you and bring out my offering and lay it before you. And he, angel of the Lord, said, I will remain until you return. Then Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. He put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot and brought them out to him under the oak and presented them. Now, up to this time, he's thinking that this is a prophet, a man. And the angel of the Lord said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread. And fire came up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. Then the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Gideon perceived that he was an angel of the Lord. He said, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace to you. Do not be afraid. You shall not die. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and named it, The Lord is Peace. To this day, it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So Gideon hadn't known that he had been entertaining an angel. He was just doing the customary thing of offering food and drink to a stranger. His outcry to God was a pious one. To see an angel sent by God made him afraid of being killed by the holiness of God. God spoke to him directly, not the angel who had left. Peace, do not be afraid, you shall not die. Gideon built an altar named Yahweh is Peace. Verse 25. Now on the same night the Lord said to him, take your father's bull and a second bull 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of this stronghold in an orderly way, and take a second bull and offer a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah, which you shall cut down. So I kind of see this as like God testing Gideon's faithfulness. Will Gideon be obedient? And of course, I mean, right there at home, there's this altar to a false god and this wooden pole, which is to be worshipped for this female goddess of fertility. So what did Gideon do? Then Gideon took 10 men from his servants and did as the Lord had spoken to him. And because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day, he did it by night. So Gideon passed the test, even though this was his own father's altar and the city might hold him accountable. He did it. He did what God said. When the people of the city got up early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal had been torn down, and the Asherah which had been beside it had been cut down. And the second bull had been offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, who did this thing? And when they searched and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, did this thing. Then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die, for he has torn down the altar of Baal, and indeed he has cut down the Asherah which was beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal? Or will you save him? In other words, save the false god? Whoever will contend for him will be put to death by morning. For if he is a god, let him contend for himself, since someone has torn down his altar. Therefore, on that day, he named Gideon Jerubbaal, which is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he had torn down his altar. So Gideon's father had an interesting reaction to the news that his son tore down his altar and Asherah pole. These belonged to him, but instead of punishing his son, he stood up for him. If Baal is offended, let Baal deal with Gideon. That was his response. He rhetorically asked the townspeople, will you save Baal? The father took away the right to punish from the townspeople and put it on the false god. Then the father gave Gideon a new name, Jerubbaal. Now let Baal contend against him. Gideon was renamed just as Jacob had become Israel and Abram had become Abraham. So from now on, Gideon and Jerubbaal are used interchangeably. So now the scene shifts. Then all the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east assembled together, and they crossing over the Jordan River, and camped in the valley of Jezreel. So the Spirit of the Lord covered Gideon like clothing, and he blew a trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called together to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they also were called together to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet them. So God had earlier told Gideon that he was being sent to save Israel from the Midianites, and now the enemy shows up. God then puts his spirit on Gideon, and Gideon rallies the militia from the neighboring tribes. But Gideon isn't entirely convinced he is doing the wise thing. So he goes to God about his doubts. Judges 6:36. Then Gideon said to God, "If you are going to save Israel through me, as you have spoken, behold, I am putting a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. And if there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will save Israel through me, as you have spoken." And it was so. When he got up early the next morning and wrung out the fleece, he wrung the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not let your anger burn against me, so that I may speak only one more time. Please let me put you to the test only one more time with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground." And God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece, and dew was all on the ground. So God rejected pride by acknowledging it was God who was going to save Israel through him. Normally, we are not told to test God. Jesus refused to do so when the devil tempted him in the desert. The Israelites in Exodus got in trouble for testing God for water at Massa and Meribah. Gideon's tests, however, were only to gain confirmation of God's intention and his presence. "I am with you." He asked God not to be angry with him, but he was going to take on a much larger army, and he wanted that comfort. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him got up early and camped beside the spring of Arad. And the camp of Midian was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, "The people who are with you are too many for me to hand Midian over to them. Otherwise, Israel would become boastful, saying, 'My own power has saved me.' Now therefore come and proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, 'Whoever is afraid and worried is to return and leave Mount Gilead.'" So 22,000 from the people returned, but 10,000 remained. And the spring of Arad is at the bottom of Mount Gilead. So that's why the two are mentioned. And there's a photograph of the spring. It still is gushing out water like crazy. And to the right, there's a stream that flows. And it's actually a national park of Israel. And people still enjoy the park. They still camp there with their like having picnics and things like that. People bathe in the water, and the water is very pure and clean. You could drink it. So this section shows how God is the one, and he intends to destroy the enemy with his own power, not with that of the Israelites. He dismisses all of those who are afraid of being killed, and so we go on. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "The people are still too many, 10,000. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. So it shall be that he and of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. But every one of them I say to you, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So he brought the people down to the water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "You shall put everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps in one group, and everyone who kneels down to drink in another." So the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people kneeled down to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, "I will save you with the 300 men who lapped, and will hand the Midianites over to you. So have all the other people go, each man to his own home." So the men who kept their heads and eyes up while drinking water were the alert ones. They appreciated the danger of not being far from the enemy. The others fell to their knees and leaned over and drank, making themselves vulnerable to an attacker. Those people God dismissed and then told Gideon to attack with just the 300. So the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets in their hands. So these 10,000 people are leaving, but they're leaving their stuff behind and they're leaving their trumpets behind. So there would be a lot of trumpets, enough for 300 men. And Gideon dismissed all the other men of Israel, each to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Now on the same night it came about that the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have handed it over to you." Well, that's a pretty direct instruction. But if you are afraid to go down, go with Purah, your servant, down to the camp, down to the enemy camp, so that you will hear what they say, and afterward you will have the courage to go down against the camp. So obviously he had 300 men. The other side has 135,000 men. Would that be reasonable to be afraid? Yes, the answer is yes. So he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outposts of the army that was in the camp. What he didn't know is that God had prepared the Midianite army and its allies in a way that was a secret. So that night, God tells Gideon to go down to the enemy camp to hear what they say. That was a pretty dangerous thing for him to do, but he is a courageous man. Now, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as numerous as the sand in the seashore. And Lee, would you do me a favor and mute your camera, please? Thank you. Behold. Okay, let me start over. Verse 12. Now the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the people of the east were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number as numerous as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend. And he said, "Behold, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down so that the tent collapsed." That's an amazing dream. A dream of a loaf of bread tumbling into a camp and knocking down a tent so that it turns upside down. A loaf of barley bread was considered a poor man's food. And his friend, verse 14, and his friend replied, "This is nothing other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has handed over to him Midian and all the camp." When Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, he bowed and worshipped. So Gideon was that rolling loaf. Sounds kind of ridiculous that a loaf of bread would knock down a tent, but God gave the other fellow the interpretation of that dream. The entire camp was terrified of Gideon and his God. How remarkable that it is that the enemy both received and then gives to Gideon the revelation that confirms what God was telling Gideon. Gideon bowed in worship to our awesome God. The enemy will absolutely be defeated. Then he returned to the camp of Israel and said, "Arise, for the Lord has handed over to you the camp of Midian." He is completely committed now. No more doubts. And he divided the 300 men into 3 units, and he put trumpets and empty pitchers into the hands of all of them, with torches inside the pitchers. Then he said to them, "Look at me, and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I and all who are with me blow the trumpet, then you also blow the trumpets around the entire camp and say, 'For the Lord, for Yahweh, and for Gideon.'" Gideon is fully committed. He declares to his men that the Lord has handed them over to the enemy. And one thing that I really appreciate is that Gideon is leading from the front. He isn't in the rear with the gear. He's going to the enemy camp with his men. He led by example. He says, "Do as I do." That's real leadership. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle night watch, which is about midnight, when they had just posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. When the 3 units blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers, they held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing, and shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." And each stood in his place around the camp. They didn't attack, they just stood there. And all the army ran, crying out as they fled. And when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one against another, even throughout the entire army. So each clay pitcher concealed a torch so that the enemy could not see the 300 approaching the enemy camp. Then they took out their torches and smashed the pitchers, which must have caused a lot of noise. The enemy watchmen would see that they were surrounded. The blast of trumpets and shouts would indicate tens of thousands of Israelites were attacking because they had all of these trumpets. Every trumpet must have represented 100 men. Panic ensued, but the 300 stood their place on 3 sides of the camp. The army ran away in the dark, killing one another, while not touching the 300. So now we're getting into the part to where there is an exploitation of this victory, with the enemy army running away, and Gideon and his men and others are hacking away at them, basically killing them. And the army fled as far as Bethshetta toward Zerah. And I don't know if you can see that on your screen or not, but it's just to the, I don't have a, would be right about there, right about there if I see that correctly. And the men of Israel were summoned from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh. So all these men were called back to duty, and they pursued Midian. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against Midian and take control." Now, Midian, you might see on the map, is at the bottom of the map on the left-hand side. And you see the blue arrows. That's where they went to the Jordan River, to where they had the places where you could ford the river. You could actually walk across. and they lay in wait there to kill the enemy if they got so far. So the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took control of the waters as far as Bethbara and the Jordan. And they captured the two leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and they killed Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. That's kind of interesting. We started our story at a winepress, and now we're killing their generals at a winepress, or at least one of them. So while they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon from across the Jordan. Now we have chapter 8. Then the men of Ephraim said to Gideon, "What is this thing that you have done to us, not calling upon us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they quarreled with him vehemently. And he said to them, "What have I done in comparison with you? Is the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim not better than the vintage of Abiezer? Ab, Abi, Abiezer. God has handed over to you the leaders of Medium, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you?" Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. So what was this quarrel all about? Well, they had not been called to fight after the 300 men routed the camp. uh, Asher, Naphtali, and Zebulun were. The loot that the panicked army left behind would have been enormous, 135,000 men and all their stuff. So Ephraim was angry that they did not get share in the booty of that enemy camp. But Gideon kind of does a verbal judo with them and says, "Hey, look, is not the leftover grapes of your country, of your area, better than the best wine of mine? And God has handed you the leaders. And gee, what did I do in comparison to you?" So he's really kind of playing humble there, but it diffuses the disagreement. Then Gideon and the 300 men who were with him came to the Jordan and crossed over, exhausted yet still pursuing. And he said to the men of Zekhoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who are following me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." And the leaders of Succoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?" In other words, you haven't won yet, buddy. We're not picking sides here. We're not giving you any bread. So Gideon said, "For this answer, when the Lord has handed over to me Zebah and Zalmunna, I will thrash your bodies with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." Then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke similarly to them. And the men of Penuel answered him just as the men of Succoth had answered. So he said also to the men of Penuel, "When I return safely, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000 men, all who were left of the entire army of the east, army of the people of the east. For the fallen were 120,000 swordsmen. Wow, that's a lot of people. Gideon went up by the way of those who lived in tents to the east of Nobah and Jogbeha, and he attacked the camp when the camp was unsuspecting. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the entire army. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres. And he captured a youth from Zekhoth and questioned him. Then the youth wrote down for him the leaders of Zekhoth and its elders, 77 men. And he came to the men of Zekhoth and said, "Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are weary?" Then he took the elders of the city and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and he disciplined the men of Zekhoth with them. And he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. This is such a different reaction to that of, say, Deborah, who had tribes not volunteer to fight, and how, while they were criticized, they certainly weren't punished like this. Okay, Judges 8:18. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, where were the men whom you killed at Tabor? That would be Mount Tabor. And he said, you and they were alike, each one resembling the son of a king. And he said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if only you had let them live, I would not kill you. So he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise, kill them. But the youth did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise up yourself and attack us, for as the man, so is his strength. So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna and took the crescent amulets which were on their camels' necks. And those were like symbols of authority, royal symbols, probably made of gold with precious jewels, that type of thing. So they were of great value as well as status. Judges 8:22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son's son as well, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. And this is very interesting because Israel wanted to start a dynasty of kings. But despite what Gideon said, Israel rejected God as king of Israel. And this is later clearly stated in 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel 8:7, I put it in bold print there. They have rejected me from being king over them. God speaking. And in 1 Samuel 12:12, it reads in bold print, yet the Lord your God was your king. And yet they wanted a man as king. Judges 8:24. Yet Gideon said to them, after rejecting kingship and rejecting this dynasty idea, he said, I would request of you that each of you give me an earring from his plunder, for they had gold earrings because they, meaning the people that were killed, were Ishmaelites. And that's another word for Midianites. And they said, we will certainly give them to you. So they spread out a garment, and every one of them tossed an earring there from his plunder. The weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. Apart from the crescent amulets, the ear pendants, and the purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and apart from the neck chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made it an ephod and placed it in his city Ophrah. But all Israel committed infidelity with it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. So there's been a real turn of events. Gideon assisted God. God worked through Gideon, and God did amazing things to bring victory to the Israelites. Gideon courageously pursued the bad guys, the invaders, defeated them completely. He comes home, has offered the kingship, and then he says, no, let God rule over you instead. And, kind of looking back in the last 5 times of unfaithfulness, I don't know how that worked out very well. But in any case, he then asks for gold. And, this reminds me of the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, where Aaron collects gold earrings from the Israelites that are out there in the desert and builds a golden calf that they then worship. And that's really something. So, in any case, Gideon made it into an ephod, some garment that's worn by a high priest. So maybe while he rejected being a king, he thought about being a priest. I don't know. But let's take a look at the. So here is a picture. I'm not going to bother reading all that, but here's a picture of an ephod. You can see it's identified there on the image. It's basically like an apron that connects and supports the jeweled breastplate, the breastplate that has the 12 precious stones in it, each one representing a tribe of Israel. And apparently, this is what it would kind of look like. So, according to both Joshua and Judges, the tabernacle, which is also called the tent of meeting, and the house of God was in the town of Shiloh. So, all the priestly garments, including the ephod, I mean, the real ephod, would have been there it's about 7 miles north. In Joshua 18, it identifies the tent of meeting as being at Shiloh, and so does Judges 18:31. So why did he make an ephod? We don't really know because maybe he saw himself as a priest. You recall that this whole record started with Gideon making two altars. Was his idea and the other was God's. We really just don't know. We're just left with the fact that he made this thing, and it became a snare. In Judges 8:27, we'll read it again. Gideon made it into an ephod and placed it in the city Ophrah, but all Israel committed infidelity with it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. So I asked Chat GPT the question about that. Why would it become a snare? And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll just read the bold print. It's idolatrous tendencies of the people. It was a diversion from the true worship of God. It was a symbol of division, and that, well, his area, his tribe has it, and the other area, other tribes don't, and contradiction to God's commandments. Not that it was made an idol, but it was made by the people's attitudes into an idol. It 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 shows how there's a balance between genuine worship and dangers of idolatry, even though the intentions may have been initially pure. So Midian was subdued, and this is the conclusion of the story. So Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel, and they did not lift their heads up any more. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Then Jerubbaal, who's also Gideon, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons who were his direct descendants, for he had many wives. And his concubine, I mean, like having that many wives, and then he has a concubine as well, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. And Gideon the son of Joash died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash, and Oprah of the Abiezrites. Then it came about as soon as Gideon was dead that the sons of Israel again committed infidelity with the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. So the sons of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had saved them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in accordance with all the good that he had done for Israel. So Gideon had violated one of the Lord's commandments, which was not to mess around with women outside of the nation of Israel. The Israelites were to marry Israelites, and that's that. But he had this girlfriend on the side. And Shechem, although it was in the general territory, Shechem was in the pagan native area. And despite these two mistakes, one making the ephod and having a non-Israelite concubine, the Bible lists Gideon among what I would call the home of fame, and that's in Hebrews 11. in Hebrews 11, it reads, "Now faith is the certainty of things hoped for, the proof of things not seen, for by it the people of old gained approval." And then verse 32, "And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell you of Gideon." And then it goes down in verse 34, "Who quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was weakness, did not receive what was from weakness, were made strong, became mighty, and put foreign armies to flight," which is what he certainly did. So Gideon had done well in God's eyes. He gained approval through his faith, despite testing with the fleecing and being understandably afraid. How can we gain approval? Well, we do it by how we deal with people and their faith in accordance with the commandings of God. And we do it by how we represent God in our actions and also how we teach the word. So what can we take away from this example of Gideon? Well, God wants us to be free from slavery to sin and doubt. God does not abandon his people when they acknowledge him. Even after 4 times of gross unfaithfulness, God remained faithful to his covenant with Abraham. And that was when he called Gideon. He calls on people to help with that. God works through people to save his people. That's why ministers, people that volunteer to serve God, are so important to us. Gideon was not criticized for asking for confirmation and reassurance. Once he had it, he acted with courage and conviction. And we must too. We must act with courage and conviction. And that's where we need encouragement from people, and we need to keep our heads in the Word. So God saved Israel through Gideon, but not with man's power, but his own. Not with angels wiping out the enemy, but through Gideon trusting him. And so we need to trust him as well. So when you're in trouble and have problems, God has not abandoned you. We need to acknowledge him, seek his wisdom, get rid of any sin that's bothering us, and act with courage and conviction. God is faithful to his new covenant that his Son brought into being. God is with you. Peace, do not be afraid. Let us walk in the Spirit God has put inside us and rejoice that we belong to him and to Jesus. And then finally, as an extra bonus, I put together the similarities that you might recognize of Gideon's record to the record of Moses. And if you're so interested, you can print screen this on your computer, or you can just refer to it at another time. I won't take up any more time. Before I open the floor for our group discussion, for our YouTube audience, if you enjoyed the teaching, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you won't miss any future content. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Your feedback helps us grow together as a community. If you feel led to support our ministry, please consider checking out the links in the description. Your contributions help us continue to spread the gospel of the kingdom of God and build up the body of Christ. Now let's open the floor for some lively discussion that will be posted in a separate video.